The paper crinkled in Elvira Brenner's fist as she stood on the porch of the most imposing ranch house she had ever seen in her 26 years of life, her knuckles white around a debt notice that represented every nightmare her family had suffered through in the past 8 months. The afternoon sun hammered down on the New Mexico territory like a brand pressed against raw skin, and the dust on her boots told the story of 3 days of hard riding from Santa Fe. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times over those 3 days, had arranged the words in careful order the way you arrange coins when you do not have many of them, had told herself she would not flinch, would not show weakness, would not give this man even the smallest crack through which to push her further down. And then the door opened. Louis Carson was not what she had expected. She had expected someone shaped by cruelty, someone who wore his power the way some men wore spurs, loud and sharp and designed to draw blood. Instead, she found a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and weathered in the way that honest outdoor work weathers a person, with dark eyes that moved across her face with something she could not immediately name. Not hunger, not contempt. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. Something that looked disturbingly like recognition, as though he had been expecting her or someone very much like her for a long time. "Miss Brenner," he said, not a question. The fact that he already knew her name sent ice through her chest. She raised the paper, held it between them like a shield. "I came about my brother's debt," she said, and her voice did not shake, and she was proud of herself for that because everything else inside her was trembling. $42.80, which Harlan borrowed from you last spring before he got sick. I have the full amount, Mr. Carson, every penny. I did not come here to beg or to bargain. I came to pay what my family owes and to close this account between us, and then I will be on my way." She held out the small leather pouch. It represented 2 months of school teaching in Santa Fe, 3 weeks of taking in laundry, and the sale of the silver brooch her mother had given her the year she died. It weighed almost nothing in her hand, but it had cost her absolutely everything. Louis Carson looked at the pouch. He looked at her. And then he did something she had not rehearsed for at all. He stepped back from the doorway and said quietly, "Come inside, Miss Brenner. There is something you need to know." The dark past she was about to walk into had been building long before she arrived at this door. Long before Harlan Brenner had ridden up to the Carson ranch with his hat in his hand and a cough in his chest that neither of them yet knew would eventually kill him. It had begun, really, in the winter of 1881, in a small town called Cimarron in the northern reaches of the New Mexico territory, where 2 very different people were each surviving the particular loneliness of their circumstances without knowing the other existed. Elvira had been the daughter of Jonas Brenner, a schoolteacher turned dry goods merchant who had moved his family west from Missouri in 1873, when Elvira was 8 years old, chasing the particular dream that the West sold to people desperate enough to buy it. Jonas was a good man and a poor businessman, which is a combination that produces a specific kind of poverty, the kind that is always almost solved but never quite gets there. He died in the spring of 1879 of a fever, leaving Elvira, then 14, and her brother Harlan, then 12, in the care of their Aunt Cecily in Santa Fe. Aunt Cecily was a practical woman who loved them in a practical way and taught Elvira that love expressed as usefulness was still love. It was not a romantic education, but it was a durable one. Harlan grew up bright and restless and a little reckless, the way that boys who lose their fathers too young sometimes grow up, chasing something he could not name across the wide territory. He had a gift with horses and a charm that could make strangers feel like old friends within an hour, and he used both of these things in equal measure to get himself into situations that occasionally required rescue. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who believed good outcomes were more likely than the evidence supported. Louis Carson, meanwhile, had come to the Carson ranch the hard way. His father, Samuel Carson, had carved the place out of the New Mexico territory through a combination of relentless work and the kind of ruthlessness that frontier land acquisition sometimes required. Samuel had died in 1880 during a dispute with a neighboring ranching family over water rights, a dispute that Louis, then 22, and suddenly the owner of 4,000 acres and 40 head of cattle, had resolved not through the violence his father might have preferred, but through a quietly negotiated legal agreement that left both parties diminished but alive. Louis had learned early that secrets in a small territory had a way of compounding like debt, and he had built his life around a certain careful transparency, which is to say, he was the kind of man who said less than he knew, but meant every word of what he said. The Carson Ranch sat 3 hours south of Cimarron in the high plains country, where the grass was good in the wet years and dangerous in the dry ones, and the sky was so enormous and so blue that newcomers sometimes stopped their horses just to stare at it. Louis had grown the operation carefully over 3 years, adding cattle, hiring 2 hands he trusted, building a bunkhouse and a proper barn, and expanding the main house until it was solid and comfortable if not precisely warm. What the house lacked, his ranch hand Pedro Vasquez had once told him with the bluntness of long friendship, was a woman's understanding of what a space was for. Louis had not argued with this observation. He simply had not known what to do about it. It was February of 1882 when Harlan Brenner first appeared at the Carson Ranch, having heard from a man in Cimarron that Louis was looking for seasonal help with the spring branding. Harlan was 22 by then, lean and sharp-eyed, and he could indeed work horses with a skill that impressed even Pedro, who was not easily impressed. Louis hired him on the spot for the season, which stretched from February through July, and in that time Harlan became a fixture around the place, easy and entertaining and genuinely useful in the specific way that charming, capable people are useful, which is to say they make the difficult work feel like less of a burden. But Harlan had secrets. Not dark or criminal ones, but the smaller kind that accumulate around a person who is fighting a private battle they cannot bring themselves to name aloud. The cough had started in March, dry and persistent at first, then wetter and more insistent as the weeks went on. He hid it with the particular stubbornness of young men who believe that acknowledging illness will somehow make it real. Louis noticed. Pedro noticed. Neither said anything for weeks, which is its own kind of cruelty that the West practiced as a form of respect for a man's pride. In April, Harlan had come to Louis with his hat in his hands and genuine embarrassment on his face, and asked if he might borrow $42.80 against his wages, to pay for a consultation with the doctor in Cimarron, and for some medicine the doctor had recommended the last time Harlan had quietly visited on his own time. Louis had given him the money without ceremony, noted it in his ledger the way he noted all transactions, and told Harlan to take the time he needed. The diagnosis had not been a good one. Tuberculosis, said Dr. Hennessy in Cimarron, with the careful precision of a man delivering a verdict he had delivered too many times in this climate, in this century, to people who were too young to be hearing it. Harlan had come back to the ranch quieter than he had left it, had worked through May and June with a determination that Louis recognized as the particular ferocity of a man reorganizing his priorities, and had left in early July, 2 weeks before the end of the season, saying he needed to return to Santa Fe to his sister. Louis had marked the $42.80 as a debt in his ledger and thought very little of it. He had thought considerably more about Harlan, had inquired after him twice through men who traveled to Santa Fe, and had received answers that were cheerful and vague in the way that answers are cheerful and vague when the truth behind them is not something anyone wants to put into words. Harlan Brenner had died in December of 1882, just before Christmas, in the small house in Santa Fe that he shared with Elvira and Aunt Cecily. He had been 23 years old. The cough had won. Elvira had known about the debt because Harlan had told her, near the end, in that way that dying people sometimes tell you everything they have been carrying as though they need to distribute the weight before they put it down. He had described Louis Carson as a fair man, a decent man, a man who had shown him more consideration than most would have. He had asked Elvira, with what she would later recognize as very deliberate Harlan-style maneuvering, to make sure the debt was settled. "He was good to me," Harlan had said in the rattling breath of his last weeks. "Don't let the family owe that," Elvira had promised. She kept her promises the way she kept everything, fiercely and completely, even when it cost her. It had taken her 8 months to save the money. Between the teaching position and the laundry and the sale of the brooch, 8 months of careful, grinding economy that Aunt Cecily had observed with a mixture of admiration and concern. "The man's not going to come after you for it, Elvira," Cecily had said, pragmatic as ever. "It's $40. He's a rancher with 4,000 acres. It doesn't matter what he will or won't do about it," Elvira had said. "It matters what we do." And so she had come. 3 days on horseback from Santa Fe to the Carson Ranch, because the stage did not run close enough to make it practical, with the money in a leather pouch sewn into her riding jacket, and the debt notice folded in her other pocket, and a speech prepared, and a heart that had spent 8 months being very carefully not broken, because there had been too much to do for the luxury of breaking. She sat now in Louis Carson's main room, which was larger and more comfortable than she had expected, with a stone fireplace and a good oak table, and curtains on the windows that suggested someone had once tried to make it homey. She sat with her hands folded around the leather pouch and her spine very straight, and her eyes meeting his without flinching, because flinching was a habit she had long ago trained out of herself. Louis sat across the table from her, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had poured for both of them without asking, which she had noted and filed away as information about his character. He was looking at her with that same quiet expression she had noticed at the door, and she found herself wishing he would look away, because his attention had a quality to it that made her feel seen in a way she was not prepared for. "I received word about Harlan in January," he said. "Not preamble, not apology, just the fact delivered straight. I was sorry to hear it. He was a good hand and a better man than he gave himself credit for." The words hit her somewhere between the ribs. She had not expected generosity. She had prepared for negotiation, for the calculation of a creditor, for the cold mechanics of debt collection even in reverse. She had not prepared for kindness. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised by how small her voice sounded. "I want to show you something," Louis said. He stood and moved to the roll-top desk against the far wall, opened the middle drawer, and withdrew his ledger. He brought it to the table, opened it to a page marked with a strip of leather, and turned it to face her. She looked down at the entry. It read in clear, careful script, "Harlan Brenner, seasonal wage advance, April 14, 1882, $42.80, and beneath it in the same hand but clearly added later a single word followed by a date, "Forgiven, January 12, 1883. Elvira stared at the ledger. She read the entry twice. She looked up at Louis, who was watching her with an expression she still could not entirely categorize. "You forgave it," she said, "in January, when you heard he had died." "Yes," Louis said, "before I came here, before anyone asked you. Yes." She looked back down at the ledger. The leather pouch in her hands felt suddenly very heavy, weighted now not with the cost of what it had taken to accumulate it, but with the revelation that it had never been necessary. 8 months of grinding labor. The brooch her mother had given her. The teaching and the laundry and the careful, grinding economy. All of it done in service of a debt that had already been canceled by a man she had never met, out of a generosity she had not known to expect. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, somewhere underneath everything else. But what rose up first and strongest was something she was not prepared for at all. A grief so sudden and complete it took her breath away. Because the debt was not just the debt. She understood now. The debt had been her last obligation to Harlan, her last concrete task in his name, the final thread connecting her to the active work of being his sister, and this man across the table had quietly dissolved it 3 months before she arrived without knowing what it would cost her to learn that. She pressed her lips together. She set the leather pouch on the table with great care, as though it might shatter. She stared at the grain of the oak tabletop for a long moment and refused, absolutely refused, to cry in front of a stranger. Louis watched her do all of this with the patience of a man who understood that certain silences required witnessing rather than filling. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply let her have the moment, which was perhaps the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in 8 months. "I would like to leave the money with you anyway," she said finally, her voice steady again. "I can't take it," Louis said. "You can apply it to something else. Harlan's room and board for the months he was here, something." "I don't operate that way, Miss Brenner." The certainty in his voice was quiet but absolute. "The debt is forgiven, that's the end of it." She looked up at him then, and the full weight of her situation, the 8 months of labor, the dead brother, the 3 days of riding, the dissolved debt, and this man's inexplicable patience, all of it pressed against her simultaneously, and she had the sudden, dizzying sensation of standing at the edge of something much larger than a financial transaction. "Why?" she asked. It was a simple question, and she meant it to be a simple question, but it came out with all the complexity that 8 months of grief and survival had loaded into her, and it hung between them in the afternoon light of his ranch house with far more weight than one word should carry. Louis looked at her for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of cattle and the wind moving through the grass, and somewhere further away, the sound of men working. Normal sounds. The world going on. "Because he told me about you," Louis said. "Before he left. He told me about his sister in Santa Fe, the one who was holding the family together with her own hands. He said you were the most stubborn, most honorable person he had ever known." A slight shift in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "He said if anything ever happened to him, you would come to settle his accounts. He said you would walk through fire to do it." Elvira felt something she could not name move through her chest. "He was right," she said quietly. "I know," Louis said. "That is why I forgave it. Because a woman like that should not spend another day of her life in debt for her brother's medicine." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. Less grief in it, more something else. Something that neither of them was quite ready to name or examine, but which filled the room with a particular quality of presence, the way sunlight fills a room when the curtain is moved, sudden and revealing and impossible to put back. Elvira looked down at the leather pouch on the table. Then she looked up at Louis Carson, and she understood with a clarity that was almost alarming that she had been completely wrong about what this trip was going to be. She had come to collect an obligation. She had not come to be undone by someone's decency. She asked if she might stay the night, given the late hour and the distance she had already ridden, and Louis said yes without hesitation, and showed her to the room that had been Harlan's for those months, which was clean and simply furnished, and which she was grateful for precisely because it was simple. She needed simple things around her right now. She needed clear lines and uncomplicated surfaces, while her interior landscape was doing something chaotic that she did not yet have a name for. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and held the leather pouch in her lap and thought about Harlan. She thought about how he had described Louis, a fair man, a decent man, and she thought about the entry in the ledger, forgiven January 12th, written in quiet cursive while she was still in Santa Fe teaching other people's children their letters and saving every coin toward a debt that had already been dissolved. She thought about the fact that Harlan, who had known her better than anyone, had told Louis about her, had described her, had in some way she could not yet entirely understand, connected them before he died. She wondered if that had been deliberate. It would have been very much like Harlan to arrange things from a sickbed with a particular smile on his face, setting pieces in motion with the confidence of a man who trusted the universe to follow through on his intentions. "You interfering, impossible man," she murmured to the empty room, and it was fond, completely fond, and the grief of it broke open something she had been keeping sealed for 8 months, and she finally cried. Not for long. She was not built for long, formless grief. But she cried hard and honest for about 10 minutes, and when she was done, she felt emptied out in the way that is actually the beginning of being filled back up again. She slept deeply, which surprised her. In the morning she came down to find the kitchen already busy. Louis was at the stove, and a small, round woman named Consuelo, whom Elvira gathered was the housekeeper, was making tortillas at the work table with the efficiency of someone who had been making tortillas for 40 years and saw no reason to slow down. Pedro Vasquez, the ranch hand, was outside, visible through the window, moving between the barn and the corral with a purposeful stride. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornmeal and something savory on the stove, and the morning light came through the east window in that particular low-angle way of High Plains mornings that made everything look briefly golden. Louis turned when she came in. He looked different in the morning light, somehow both more and less guarded than the previous afternoon. He had the look of a man who had done a certain amount of thinking overnight. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please," she said, and sat at the table. Consuelo glanced at her with the efficient assessment of a woman who had long been the main feminine presence in a household of men, and was conducting a rapid calculation of Elvira's character and intentions. Whatever the conclusion was, it produced a nod of moderate approval and a plate of warm tortillas placed on the table without ceremony. "Thank you," Elvira said. "You rode from Santa Fe," Consuelo said. It was not quite a question. 3 days. Consuelo made a sound that contained both admiration and reproof in equal measure. "Alone?" "Yes." Another assessing look. "You can ride, then?" "I can," Elvira said, and there must have been something in the way she said it that satisfied Consuelo, because the older woman returned to her tortillas with the air of having made a favorable judgment. Louis set a cup of coffee in front of her and sat across the table with his own. In the morning, the house felt different, less like a transaction happening in it and more like a life being lived. She found that she was not in a hurry to leave, which alarmed her somewhat. She had planned to ride back the first morning, to be on the road by sunrise. The money in the leather pouch was still sitting on the table where she had left it last night because she could not quite bring herself to put it back in her jacket, as though doing so would require her to accept that this journey was over. "What do you do in Santa Fe?" Louis asked. Not small talk, she thought. Genuine question. "I teach school," she said. "First through 5th grade. I have been teaching for 4 years. Harlan mentioned it. Said you were the best teacher in the territory and that your students were afraid of you." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, coming out before she had time to decide whether to allow it. "Harlan was a generous reporter of my virtues and a creative interpreter of my flaws," she said. "I'm a firm teacher. That is different from frightening. He also said you could cook well enough to make a decent man consider all his priorities," Louis said, and there was something in his voice now that was carefully neutral in a way that was not neutral at all. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "He exaggerated." "He didn't, actually," Louis said. "About any of it, from what I could tell." The silence that settled over this was the third variety she had experienced in his presence, and this one had a warmth to it, a tentative but unmistakable warmth, that made her set her coffee cup down and look out the window at the morning because looking at him directly suddenly required more composure than she had immediately available. She stayed through breakfast. Then she agreed to let Pedro show her the horses because she genuinely could not resist, and the Carson horses were exceptional, a fact she told Pedro with a sincerity that earned her what appeared to be his highest form of approval, which was a 3-minute detailed explanation of their bloodlines delivered entirely without being asked for. By mid-morning she was still there, and Louis had suggested, with a careful casualness that did not entirely mask what was underneath it, that if she had no urgent reason to start back that morning, she was welcome to stay through the day and he could show her around the property. She had intended to say no. She had opened her mouth to say no. What came out instead was, "If it is not an imposition." It was not an imposition. They rode out in the late morning across the high plains country that Louis had spent 3 years transforming from his father's rough operation into something he was quietly proud of. He showed her the east pasture where the spring calves were running, and the creek that marked the southern boundary of the property, and the small grove of cottonwoods near the water that he had apparently taken some care to preserve when he could have cleared them for additional grazing. She noted the preservation of the trees because it told her something about him, about the choices he made when no one was pressing him to make them. "How many acres?" she asked as they rode along the creek. 4,200, he said. "Was 4,000 when my father left it. I added 200 last year from a piece on the eastern edge that came up for sale." "You've built it up carefully," she said. "I've tried to." A pause. "My father built fast and hard. There are places on this property that still carry the marks of that." She heard what was underneath that sentence, the complicated relationship with a father's legacy, the attempt to honor what was good in it and quietly correct what was not. It was a situation she understood from a different angle, having spent years sorting through the contradictions of her own father's particular combination of warmth and impracticality. "My father was a dreamer," she said. "He moved us to New Mexico with $40 and enormous confidence. He was not a practical man." "But you are," Louis said and looked at her sidelong. "Someone had to be," she said, "and Harlan was the dreamer of the next generation." She felt the familiar pull of grief, but it was different out here, on horseback in the high plain sun, somehow less trapped. "Yes," she said, "he got that from Papa, along with the charm and the horse sense and the complete inability to believe that things might not work out." "It's not the worst quality," Louis said. "I've spent a lot of time believing things might not work out. Hasn't made the work easier." She looked at him. He was watching the middle distance, the way writers do when they are talking about something that costs them something. She had spent enough time with Harlan's particular emotional opacity to recognize when a man was saying more than the surface of his words. "You've been running this place alone since you were 22, she said. "Not accusation, observation. Pedro has been here since before I was born," Louis said. "And Consuelo runs the house like a general runs a campaign. I haven't been entirely alone. But the decisions fall on you. They do. And there is no one you share those with," she said, and she meant it practically, meant it as a factual statement about the structural reality of his situation. But the words arranged themselves in the air between them with a weight that went past practical, and she saw him absorb that weight and not deflect it. "No," he said quietly. "There isn't." They rode in silence for a while after that, a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who are not afraid of each other. Elvira found herself thinking about the shape of his life, the 4,000 acres and the ranch hands, and the well-kept house with the homey curtains that suggested some earlier, unrealized intention. She thought about a man who ran a good operation with careful integrity and went to bed at night with no one to tell about it. She thought about herself, in her small rooms in Santa Fe, teaching other people's children their letters and going home to Aunt Cecily, who was wonderful in her pragmatic way, but who could not fill the particular absence that Harlan's death had opened up. Elvira had told herself she was fine. She was surviving. She was accomplishing things. She told herself, enough of a person on her own terms that she did not need to want for more. She realized now, riding along this creek in this sunlight, doing something she recognized as a form of dishonesty with herself. They stopped at the cottonwood grove to water the horses, and Louis helped her down from the saddle with a hand at her elbow that was brief and correct, and nevertheless registered somewhere in her nervous system, with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the gesture. She busied herself with her horse's bridle, and was very careful not to look at him directly for several seconds. "Harlan talked about you a great deal," Louis said, not looking at her either, which she found both comforting and suspicious. "You mentioned that," she said. "He showed me a photograph," Louis said. "The one from the 4th of July celebration in Santa Fe, the year before he came here. You are standing with your aunt outside the school building." Elvira turned to look at him. "You recognized me yesterday," she said. "At the door. You knew who I was before I said anything." "Yes," Louis said. The confirmation of this settled in her chest in a way she was not entirely sure what to do with. He had known who she was. He had been expecting her in some shape. Had the man been carrying a picture of her in his mind for a year? "Why didn't you tell me that immediately?" she asked. "Because you were prepared for a fight," he said, turning to face her now, and his voice was entirely honest without any edge of apology. "And I thought if I told you I already knew who you were, it would feel like a trap. I wanted you to have a moment to stand on your own ground first." The precision of this, the accuracy of his reading of her, landed with something close to a physical impact. He had seen her in exactly the posture she had arrived in, armored and ready and braced for the worst, and he had decided that the most useful thing he could do for her was let her have that posture until she did not need it anymore. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Carson," she said. "Louis," he said, just that. His name offered to her directly without formality, and the simplicity of it opened something between them that neither of them pretended to examine closely but both of them felt. "Louis," she said, and the shape of his name in her mouth felt like the beginning of something. She stayed another night. She told herself it was because the afternoon had run long and the light was going, which was true enough. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way the day had felt. Riding across his land in the autumn sun, talking about their fathers and their siblings, and the particular loneliness of being the responsible one in a family of dreamers. She told herself it was practical. Consuelo made lamb stew for dinner and they ate at the big oak table with Pedro joining them, which created a particular dynamic that Elvira recognized as a family of a certain kind, the kind that forms not from blood but from proximity and mutual need and long practice. Pedro was in his 50s, compact and weathered, with a dry humor that came out in carefully timed observations, and a clear, uncomplicated affection for Louis that expressed itself as criticism and advice offered without being requested. Consuelo talked about her daughter in Cimarron and her grandchildren, and about the dry spell last summer that had reduced the creek by a third. Louis ate and listened, and occasionally said something that made everyone laugh, and Elvira sat in the middle of all of this and felt the particular warmth of a table that knew what it was for. After dinner, when Pedro had gone to the bunkhouse and Consuelo had retired, Louis and Elvira sat on the porch in the cooling night air, which in October in the New Mexico high plains had a sharpness to it, a clarity that made the stars enormous and very close. She had her coat on. He had brought out 2 cups of coffee without asking, which was becoming a habit she recognized. "I want to tell you something," Louis said after a while. She looked at him. The porch light was a single kerosene lantern, and in its light his face had the quality of a daguerreotype, all clear lines and strong shadows. "I have been thinking about this ranch," he said, "for a long time, about what it is and what it could be. My father built it as a thing to dominate, if I am being honest. He saw land the way some men see people, as something to be controlled. I have been trying to build it differently, as something to tend." "I can see that," she said, "in the way you work it." "In the cottonwoods," the slight shift in his expression, "you notice the cottonwoods." "A man who preserves trees when he does not have to tells you something about his priorities," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wrote a letter to Harlan's sister in January," he said. "After I forgave the debt, I never sent it." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound presumptuous," Louis said. "I knew he had talked to me about you. I knew I had a picture of you in my head, not just from the photograph but from everything he said. And I thought, a woman like that doesn't need a stranger writing her letters about her dead brother's debt. She needs to be left to her grief." Elvira was quiet. The stars were very bright above the cottonwoods. "What did you want to say in the letter?" she asked. A long pause. The night sounds of the high plain, insects and distant cattle and the small, constant sound of the wind. "I wanted to say that your brother talked about you as though you were a fixed point," Louis said. "The way sailors talk about a North Star, not because you were perfect but because you were certain. And I thought there was something very lonely about being the North Star." about being the thing that other people navigate by, without anyone navigating for you. Elvira felt the words hit her in the exact place they were aimed at, with a precision that should have been frightening but was instead the opposite, was instead the sensation of being seen so accurately that the usual defenses simply did not know what to do. She did not speak for a long moment. "That is an extraordinarily perceptive thing to say," she said, finally. "I have had a year to think about it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was so honest it was almost painful to hear. Not rehearsed, not angled, just true. She turned to face him. He was already looking at her, and in the lantern light his dark eyes had the quality of deep water, clear and full of depth and very, very still. "I came here to close a debt," she said slowly. "I came here with a speech prepared and a leather pouch full of money I could not really afford and a plan to be in and out in an hour." "I know," he said. "I did not come here to," she started and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure how to finish that sentence in a way that was honest without being reckless. "To feel something," he supplied gently. "Yes," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "But Harlan was extremely specific in what he told me about you, and I have spent a year carrying it around, and I would be a liar if I told you that I did not know you were coming and that I had not thought about it considerably. You knew I was coming. I knew you would come eventually. Harlan said you would. He said you'd walk through fire first." A pause. He said it the way a man says something he is counting on. The stars, the night air, the lantern between them casting its warm, unsteady light. "He maneuvered us," she said. "From his sick bed," Louis agreed, and something in his tone was fond and rueful and not at all resentful. "He always did know everyone's business better than they knew it themselves," Elvira said, and her voice caught slightly on the last word, not grief exactly, more like the feeling of grief resolving into something warmer. "He was right, though," Louis said quietly. "Wasn't he?" She looked at him for a long time in the lantern light. This careful, generous man who had forgiven a debt nobody asked him to forgive and preserved cottonwood trees because they were beautiful, and kept an unsent letter for a year because he did not want to presume. This man who had let her have her posture at his door because he understood she needed it. This man who had known who she was and had waited for her to stand on her own ground first. "Yes," she said. "He was right." Louis reached across the space between them and very carefully, very deliberately took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. He held it in both of his, warm and solid, with no urgency in the gesture and no demand, just a simple claiming of contact that asked nothing beyond itself. She let him hold her hand, and she did not look away, and the night was enormous and beautiful around them. She stayed 3 more days. Each day had its own texture. The second day she spent helping Consuelo in the kitchen, not because she was asked to, but because she wanted the occupation and the company. And in doing so she learned that Consuelo had been at the Carson Ranch for 20 years, had known Louis since he was 12, and had a perspective on the current state of his heart that she delivered in careful, incremental doses while they worked together on preserves. "He has been careful," Consuelo said, stirring. "Very careful. His father was not careful. He watched that and made his own choices." She did not say more. She did not need to. The third day Louis showed her the books. Not because she asked him to, but because he wanted to. Because he wanted her to see the operation not as a guest, but as someone he was being honest with. She sat at the roll-top desk and went through 3 seasons of ledgers with the practiced eye of a woman who had managed household accounts on very little for 4 years. And she found his operation to be sound and thoughtful and more diversified than she expected. He had invested a portion of the cattle income in a small grain operation that serviced local mills, which protected him against the worst of the cattle market fluctuations. "This was smart," she said, tapping the grain entry. "It was Harlan's idea, actually," Louis said and paused. He mentioned that his father had diversified his dry goods business to survive a bad trading year. "I applied the principle here." Elvira looked at the entry for a long moment. Harlan's idea, living in this man's ledgers, still doing good. She pressed her lips together. He would have been pleased to know that, she said. I thought you might like to know it, Louis said. On the fourth morning, which she had been telling herself for 3 days would be her last, she came downstairs to find Louis waiting with 2 horses saddled, and a lunch packed in saddlebags, and an expression that was carefully not asking anything. There is a section on the north end of the property I haven't shown you, he said, if you wanted to see it before you go. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the packed saddlebags. She thought about Santa Fe and her school and Aunt Cecily, who was pragmatic and loving, and who had told her when she left that she did not know what she was riding toward, but that she hoped it was something good. Yes, she said. All right. They rode north through the morning, into the section of the property where the high plains country began to lift gently toward the mountains, where the grass was long and golden in the autumn light, and the air had a cold clarity that made everything vivid. Louis knew the land the way you know something you have spent years paying close attention to. He knew where the ground was soft after rain, and where the winter grass held best, and where a hawk had been nesting for 3 seasons in the same juniper tree. He pointed out the hawk's tree. She thought about a man who noted where hawks nested and preserved cottonwoods and wrote letters he never sent because he did not want to presume, and she felt something she could only describe as falling, though the word was not quite right because it was not frightening. It was not the loss of balance but the settling of it, the sensation of landing somewhere that turned out to be solid. They stopped at a high point that gave a view across the whole property, the buildings small and neat in the middle distance, the cattle specks of movement in the east pasture, the creek a silver line in the south. The world went on for miles in every direction, enormous and clear and entirely indifferent to the 2 people standing in it, which she found not desolate but freeing. Out here your problem stayed your actual size. This is what you tend, she said. Yes, he said. He was standing close enough that she could hear the small shifts in his breathing. It is a good piece of land. It wants to be a good place. It already is, she said. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and in the open air of the high plain with the whole territory spread around them, they looked at each other with the particular honesty that comes when you are away from rooms and roofs, and the social architecture that tells you what expressions are permissible. I am not going to pretend, Louis said, that I want you to go back to Santa Fe. I am not going to pretend that this past week has not been the most alive I have felt in longer than I want to admit to you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve smoothness. Elvira had spent 4 years being the North Star, the fixed point, the practical one, the one who held things together by being certain. She had spent 4 years being enough for herself because the alternative was wanting more than she was sure of getting. She had built a very neat, very contained life around the principle that certainty was safer than hope. She was standing on a high plain in October 1883, looking at a man who had forgiven a dead boy's debt because of the decency of the dead boy's sister, who had kept an unsent letter for a year because he did not want to presume, who noted hawk nests and preserved cottonwood trees and showed her his ledgers because he wanted her to understand him accurately. I have a teaching contract through May, she said. He nodded, waiting. And I would not leave Aunt Cecily without proper arrangements. He continued waiting, not pushing, just present. And I would need to know that this is, she paused, looking for the word that was honest enough, real. Not a version of itself that looked real from a distance. I would need the same thing, he said. I have been the only one making decisions on this property for long enough that I do not always know what I am missing, but I know I am missing something, and I think I know, he said carefully, what it looks like. She stepped forward and kissed him. She was the one who moved, and she was glad of that, glad that it was her choice made clearly on her own ground. It was a brief kiss, warm and deliberate, and when she pulled back his expression had a quality she had never seen on it before, a kind of stunned, open gladness that she found more moving than anything practiced or polished could have been. I will come back, she said, after May, if you write to me between now and then. I will write to you, he said. He did. He wrote once a week from October through May, Letters that arrived at the small house in Santa Fe, where Aunt Cecily read the return address with significant satisfaction and said nothing, which was her version of saying everything. Louis's letters were not flowery letters. They were letters from a man who described his days with the honest particularity of someone who wanted to be known and not performed. He wrote about the winter calves and the price of beef in Cimarron, and the hawk that had moved its nest to a slightly higher juniper branch, and a conversation he had with Pedro about whether the east pasture needed rotation. He wrote about the night the temperature dropped so fast that he had to break ice on the water troughs by lantern light at 2 in the morning, and about how the stars looked doing that, enormous and very cold, and about thinking of her out there in the dark. Elvira wrote back with equal regularity and equal honesty. She wrote about her students, their particular personalities and small dramas, and the satisfaction of watching a child suddenly understand a thing they had been struggling with. She wrote about Aunt Cecily, who was well, and had taken up growing tomatoes with considerable seriousness. She wrote about the grief of Harlan, how it came and went in waves now rather than all at once, how there were whole days she did not think about it, and then something would catch her sideways, and she would miss him so hard it was like a punch to the sternum. She wrote that she had started to think of the ledger entry, forgiven January 12th, as a kind of gift from one person to another across death. She wrote that she was grateful for it in ways she could not entirely articulate. He wrote back and said he understood that, and that he thought about Harlan too, and that there were pieces of his ranch operation that Harlan had touched that he was glad to keep tending because it felt like a form of honoring. By February, their letters had grown longer and more intimate in the way that letters from two people who are falling in love always grow. Not more dramatic, but more specific, more particular, more full of the small, precise details that people share when they want to be fully known rather than attractively presented. By April, she was writing about arriving in May in a tone that made Aunt Cecily, reading over her shoulder once with cheerful shamelessness, say, "I think we should start thinking about what needs to be packed." She arrived at the Carson Ranch on the 14th of May, 1884, in the late afternoon of a warm day, riding the same horse she had ridden in October and wearing a blue dress under her riding coat instead of the somber gray one she had worn the first time. Louis was at the corral when she rode in, and he walked out to meet her with a stride that had nothing casual about it, that was entirely purposeful, and he helped her down from the saddle and held her hands and looked at her face as though checking that she was exactly as he had been picturing her, and whatever the verdict was, it satisfied him, because he smiled the way she had been waiting since October to see again. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she said. "You did," he said. Pedro was leaning on the corral fence, with an expression of studious indifference that fooled no one. Consuelo appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, and disappeared back inside with the efficient movements of a woman who had a dinner to start. That evening at the big oak table with the four of them, Pedro and Consuelo and Louis and Elvira, there was a quality to the meal that was different from October. In October she had been a guest. Tonight she sat at the table with the feeling of something settling into place, a particular rightness that was not dramatic but was absolutely unmistakable, the way a key settling into a lock is not dramatic but is perfectly exact. Louis had cleared the main house room and added shelving and a writing desk in the corner near the window, which she noticed and said nothing about immediately but which caused something to move in her chest, because a writing desk meant he had been thinking about her working there, about her life fitting inside his house, about two lives arranged together without one of them disappearing into the other. "You put in a desk," she said later, when they were on the porch with the evening coffee. "I thought you might want a place to keep your teaching notes," he said. "If you decided to take a position in Cimarron, the school there is looking for a second teacher." "You looked into that," she said. "I wanted you to have the choice," he said. "Not the situation where you had to choose between your work and this place. I wanted both things to be possible." Elvira set down her coffee cup. She looked at this man who had forgiven a debt and noted a hawk nest and written her 56 letters in 6 months and put a desk in his house so she would have a choice instead of a compromise. "Louis," she said. He looked at her. "I believe I am very much in love with you," she said, and the simplicity of saying it aloud was enormous, not in a frightening way, but in the way that putting something down after carrying it for a long time was enormous. Clean and releasing and right. He was quiet for a moment, the porch, the lantern, the stars above the cottonwoods. "I know I am very much in love with you," he said. "I have been for approximately 11 months and 16 days. I have not been counting." She laughed, and the laugh rang across the dark porch and into the warm New Mexico night, and he was smiling at her with the open gladness she had first seen in October on the high plain, and she thought about Harlan, who had maneuvered them both from a sickbed with enormous confidence that it would work out, and she thought he would have been very pleased with himself right now. "Harlan would be insufferable about this," she said. "He absolutely would," Louis said. "He would remind us approximately once a week that he had arranged it. And he would not be wrong," she said. "No," Louis agreed. "He would not." He proposed to her 2 weeks later in the cottonwood grove by the creek on a Sunday morning in late May when the cottonwoods were fully leafed out and the creek was running well from the snowmelt and the morning light was doing everything it could with the available materials. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He simply said, standing in the dappled shade with the creek sounds around them, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life building something with her, and that he was asking her to let him, and that he understood if she needed more time and that he would wait as long as she needed. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Not impulsively, but with the certainty of a woman who had spent 26 years being certain about things and knew the sensation of her own conviction when she felt it. They were married in Cimarron in June of 1884, in the small church on the main street, with Pedro as witness and Consuelo in her finest dress, and Aunt Cecily, who had made the journey from Santa Fe, and who spent the ceremony with the composed expression of a woman who had known this was coming for 7 months, and was experiencing the particular satisfaction of being right. The minister was a kind man named Reverend Albright, who said the words clearly and without unnecessary ceremony. And when Louis and Elvira faced each other to speak their vows, the directness of his eyes and the steadiness of hers were so perfectly matched that Consuelo, who had watched a great deal of life from inside a ranch kitchen, quietly wiped her eyes and then looked at anyone who noticed her doing it with an expression that dared them to comment. The wedding supper was at the hotel in Cimarron because Consuelo had insisted on cooking at the ranch, and then insisted equally hard on not having to cook for the wedding supper, which was a contradiction she resolved by declaring that the hotel could handle it and she would concentrate on the cake, which she had been making for 3 days, and which was a stacked honey cake with dried fruit that became immediately legendary among the small party assembled. Aunt Cecily took Louis aside before they went into supper and said, in the direct practical way that was her highest form of affection, "She has been holding that family together since she was 14 years old. You are getting someone who knows the cost of everything and does not waste a single piece of what she has. Do not waste her," Louis said. "I know exactly what I have, ma'am. I have been aware of it since October." Cecily looked at him for a long moment with her sharp practical eyes and then said, "Good," which was her version of a blessing, and it was completely sincere. Elvira took up the teaching position in Cimarron that fall, riding into town 3 days a week on a gray mare that Louis selected for her with the careful attention he gave to all his horses, and teaching 23 children in a one-room schoolhouse that she organized with the same fierce efficiency she brought to everything she undertook. The children were initially somewhat wary of her and became, within 4 weeks, devoted to her in the complete way that children become devoted to a teacher who takes them seriously and holds them to high expectations and nevertheless communicates that she finds them fundamentally worthwhile. At the ranch, she took up the management of the household finances with the same practiced eye she had brought to Louis's ledgers, and identified 3 places where small adjustments could meaningfully improve the operation's margins, which she presented to Louis one evening at the desk she had claimed by the window with a thoroughness that made him sit very still for a moment and then say, "You should have been doing this from the beginning." "I have been doing my version of it since I was 14, she said. "I just didn't have anything as solid to work with." He looked at her across the room, this woman at the desk in the window of his house, the lamplight on her face, the ledger open in front of her, and felt something move through him that he recognized as a particular species of gratitude, the kind that does not find its object in any single thing but in the accumulated weight of everything, in the whole shape of what his life had become. "Elvira," he said. She looked up. "I need you to know," he said, "that every day I am aware of exactly how fortunate I am." She looked at him with the directness that was one of the first things he had loved about her face. "Good," she said. "I am aware of it too. Now come and look at this entry in the grain account because I think there is an error from last August." He came and looked, and there was indeed an error, and she was right, and he sat beside her at the desk while she explained it and felt, in the unceremonious ordinary beauty of the moment, entirely and completely at home. In the spring of 1885, Elvira realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Louis, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she was learning to hold good things quietly for a moment before she shared them, learning that she did not always have to immediately distribute what she had. She sat with the knowledge and felt it and thought about Harlan and thought about what Harlan would have said, which was something enthusiastic and slightly ridiculous that would have made her laugh, and she smiled to herself and held it, and then on the 4th morning she told Louis over breakfast. His face went through 3 things very quickly. First something that was pure shock, then something that was joy so strong it was almost painful to witness. Then a sort of settling, a quiet, profound settling, as though something he had long hoped for had arranged itself into place. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said, and she was very well. She was better than she had been in a long time. "A child," he said. "Elvira." "A child," she agreed. He put his forehead against their joined hands for a moment, briefly, and she felt his breath and the warm, solid weight of his presence, and felt something inside her that was beyond happiness. That was a kind of completeness she had not known to want until she found herself inside it. Consuelo received the news with enormous satisfaction and immediately began a list of things that needed to be made and done and arranged. Pedro said, when told, "About time," which was the highest expression of approval available to him. Aunt Cecily, informed by letter, wrote back a response that was 3 pages long and contained approximately 12 different pieces of practical advice, and 1 sentence at the very end that read simply, "Your father would have been so glad," which was the most personal thing Cecily had ever committed to paper, and which Elvira read and reread and eventually folded carefully and kept in the small cedar box where she kept the things that mattered most. The baby arrived in October of 1885, a boy, healthy and loud and furious with the world in the way of new persons who have opinions about everything and the vocabulary for none of them yet. They named him Harlan Jonas Carson, which was both a tribute and a decision made without discussion, because both of them arrived at it independently and said it simultaneously on the morning of his birth, which made Louis laugh in a way that the new baby immediately found interesting and turned toward. Harlan Jonas Carson grew up to be, as it turned out, exactly like his namesake, charming and horse-gifted and slightly reckless, with a confidence in good outcomes that Elvira found both exhausting and entirely familiar, and which she recognized with great fondness as the family trait she had thought was lost. The debt notice lived in the small cedar box alongside Aunt Cecily's letter and the $42.80 leather pouch, which Elvira had kept even after Louis would not take the money. She had eventually spent the coins, a few at a time, on things for the house, on a bolt of curtain fabric and seeds for the kitchen garden and a book for the school, spending them in a way that felt like honoring the labor they represented. But the pouch itself she kept, and the debt notice with its folded creases. And added to the collection in early 1884, the unsent letter that Louis had eventually given her, the one he had written in January 1883 and kept in his desk drawer for 10 months. She had read it the night he gave it to her and understood why he had not sent it. It was the letter of a man being fully honest about things he was not entirely sure he had the right to say, and its honesty was so complete and so careful that reading it had felt like being handed something very fragile and very valuable that she would not have been ready to receive in January of 1883, in the first sharp weeks of her grief. He had known that. He had waited. He had been right. She put the letter in the cedar box with everything else that was irreplaceable. By 1887, the ranch had grown further. Louis had added 600 acres to the north, the section he had shown her on their first long ride, and the grain operation had expanded to the point where it employed 2 additional men and contributed a reliable third of the ranch's income. Elvira was still teaching in Cimarron, 2 days a week now rather than 3, because she had arranged her curriculum such that efficiency covered what more time used to be required for, and because Harlan Jonas was 2 years old and in the stage of development that required considerable supervision. Pedro, 60 now, had taken on a less physically demanding role, managing the hiring of seasonal hands and keeping the operation schedule with a precision that none of the younger men could match, because he had been observing it for longer than they had been alive. He had become, in the strange organic way that such things happen, a grandfather figure to Harlan Jonas, who called him Abuelo Pedro with absolute comfort, and received from Pedro the particular dignified affection that Pedro expressed as patient tolerance, and which fooled no one. Consuelo had her daughter visit from Cimarron regularly now, bringing the grandchildren, and the Carson ranch on Sunday afternoons in good weather had a quality of family in the broadest sense. People sitting on the porch and children running in the yard, and the sound of voices and laughter, and someone always in the kitchen making something. And Louis would stand at the edge of this scene sometimes, and look at it with the expression Elvira had come to understand as his form of counting his blessings, which he did quietly and regularly, and without making a performance of it. In the spring of 1888 their second child arrived, a girl this time, whom they named Cecily Margaret Carson, Cecily for Elvira's aunt and Margaret for Louis's mother, whom he had lost when he was 8 years old and spoke of rarely but with great tenderness. Little Cecily arrived in the world with considerably less fury than her brother had, looked around the room with an expression of calm assessment that Consuelo said she had seen before, and it meant the child had strong opinions she was keeping to herself, and immediately set about becoming the organized center of gravity around which her brother's chaos orbited. The letter that arrived from Santa Fe when little Cecily was 3 months old was from Aunt Cecily herself, who reported, in her practical epistolary style, that she had sold the small house in Santa Fe and intended to come and live near them in Cimarron. As she was 63 years old and found the city more tiring than it used to be, and believed that her grandniece and grandnephew required her direct influence as a counterweight to what she delicately described as the more expansive tendencies of the Brenner side of the family. Elvira read this letter at the desk by the window and felt something warm and complete settle through her chest. She wrote back by return post and said that there was a room ready for her aunt whenever she chose to come, and that both children had been asking after her, and that Harlan Jonas had recently shown a gift for storytelling that she was fairly certain came from somewhere in the family line, and that Cecily was going to need all the pragmatic influence available. Aunt Cecily arrived in September, compact and sharp-eyed, and carrying 2 trunks and a tomato plant that she had apparently been unwilling to leave behind. She moved into the room they had prepared for her with the efficiency of a woman who had been rearranging rooms for 60 years, assessed the house and the children and Pedro and Consuelo with rapid accuracy, told Louis that his kitchen garden was underutilized and that she intended to address this, and sat down at the big oak table for supper that first evening as though she had always been there. Louis watched her settle in and leaned over to Elvira and said quietly, "She and Consuelo are going to run this household inside of a week." "Yes," Elvira said, equally quietly. "I am looking forward to seeing it." He took her hand under the table, the way he had taken it that first night on the porch in October 2 years ago, and held it in his, warm and solid, and she pressed his hand with hers, and the table around them was full of the noise and warmth and particularness of the people she loved most in the world. She thought about a morning in October 1883 when she had stood on this house's porch with a leather pouch full of hard-won money and a prepared speech and an armor she had spent 8 months building, and she thought about the door opening and the man on the other side of it who had known her name before she said it, and who had looked at her not with a creditor's calculation, but with the recognition she had not been able to name at the time, and she thought she understood now what it had been. He had recognized someone who was carrying more than they should have to carry alone. He had recognized the particular posture of a person who had been the strong one for too long. And before he had done anything else, before he had shown her the ledger or told her about the unsent letter or taken her hand on the porch, he had made a space in the doorway and said, "Come inside. There is something you need to know." The debt had been forgiven long before she arrived to pay it, but the arrival had been the point. Harlan, from his sickbed with his enormous confidence in good outcomes, had known that, had counted on it. The cottonwood trees by the creek were fully grown now, tall and generous, throwing shade across the water where Harlan Jonas would spend most of his summer afternoons for the next 15 years, trying to catch fish, with a patience he had not inherited from either parent, but which Pedro had apparently successfully installed in him over the course of 100 Sunday mornings. The hawk had been in the same juniper tree for 6 seasons, and Louis still noted its annual return in the same quiet way. He noted all things he valued, with attention and without ceremony. In the evenings when the children were asleep and Aunt Cecily and Consuelo had retired, and Pedro had gone to the bunkhouse, Louis and Elvira sat on the porch in the cooling night air with 2 cups of coffee and the enormous New Mexico stars above them, and talked about the day and the operation and the children, and occasionally about the larger territory of their lives, the history that had brought them here, the unexpected shapes of things. "Do you think about what would have happened if you had taken the money?" She asked him one such evening, in the fall of 1888, the 5th anniversary of her first arrival on this porch. He thought about it seriously the way he always thought about real questions. "I think you would have gone back to Santa Fe," he said, "and considered the account closed, and I would have spent the next several years wondering." "Wondering what?" "What Harlan's North Star was like in person," he said. She made a sound that was half laugh, half something else. "That letter you wrote," she said, "the one you didn't send, I read it again last week." He looked at her, and I think," she said, "that you wrote it knowing you were going to give it to me eventually. I don't think you ever actually believed you weren't going to send it. I think you were saving it." A pause, the stars, the wind in the cottonwoods. "Maybe," he said, and the honesty in the word was complete. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had done perhaps 1,000 evenings by now and which still felt, each time, like something she had chosen rather than something that had simply accumulated. He put his arm around her, and the porch was quiet, and the ranch was quiet, and the territory stretched away in every direction, enormous and clear and entirely itself. "He would be so pleased," she said softly. "He would be insufferable," Louis agreed, and his voice was warm with it, full of fondness for a young man who had died at 23 and left behind, in the particular way that some people leave things. A gift shaped like a debt and an instruction and a North Star and a man who had written a letter and kept it and waited, quietly and without urgency, for the right door to open. Yes, Elvira said. He would be completely insufferable. She smiled into the shoulder of the man who had forgiven everything before she came to ask, and the night was full of stars, and somewhere on the property a hawk had settled into its juniper tree for the night, and in the room above them 2 children slept in the uncomplicated way of children who have been told they are loved and have believed it, and the Carson ranch sat solid and tended in the dark, and the ledger in the roll-top desk said what it had always said: forgiven. January 12, 1883. And after it, written in the same careful hand on a different day in different ink, the ink of a pen picked up on a different morning by a different version of the same man, a man who had waited and hoped and been right to do both, and found. The cottonwoods whispered in the dark. The creek ran south. The stars held steady. And on the porch of the house that had been a thing to dominate and had become a thing to tend, 2 people sat together in the particular certainty of those who have been fully known and have fully known another, which is the only treasure the frontier or any other landscape has ever offered that was worth the whole journey to find.